A lot more in that to get to, and we will as the hour continues. But we have a legend standing by, ready to go in Los Angeles this morning, and we're thrilled to bring him into the conversation. You may have seen the announcement yesterday that we have a huge fight coming to regular television.
Not pay-per-view, yes.
Here on ESPN from Brisbane, Australia. July 1st, 9 o'clock Eastern on ESPN, Manny Pacquiao will fight Jeff Horn in what may signal a little bit of a shift in the direction that big-time boxing is going. And if you are our age, then there is no bigger name in boxing promotion than the name Bob Arum, who is standing by and joins us live this morning from the Shell Pennzoil Performance Line. Bob Arum, Mike and Mike here, good morning, and thank you so much for taking the time. How are you this morning?
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be with you guys.
It's a pleasure to have you. Let's start with this fight in particular and then get to what it may mean. What can the public expect to see from Pacquiao? Last time we saw him, he was fighting Mayweather. Obviously, he talked afterwards about having a shoulder. He's now ready to return. What should the public be expecting to see from Pacquiao in his return?
Well, Pacquiao actually has fought twice since the Mayweather fight. Unfortunately, both fights were on pay-per-view, and therefore the audience was relatively limited. But this time, we're going to see Manny Pacquiao the first time he's been on free over-the-air television. A great gift from ESPN and Manny Pacquiao. You don't have to dig into your pocket. It's a great, great start of the July 4th weekend.
And we have learned to live with pay-per-view, knowing it has been there for a while now. What does this mean for boxing? What can this do for boxing to have so many more sets of eyes on it?
Well, I think it's very important for boxing to have the biggest possible audience. I mean, look at professional football, particularly the Super Bowl or the playoffs, massive audiences. Why? One of the reasons is people don't have to pay extra to watch it. Now in boxing, the big fights have always been or recently been on premium television, and then the bigger fights are on pay-per-view, and people have to go into their pocket to watch it. Now, thanks to ESPN and Manny Pacquiao, we're going to be able to see a Manny Pacquiao championship fight against a really tough Australian kid for free. And we're going to get a massive audience.
That's coming up again Friday, July 1st. I'm curious to get your overall take, because Mike and I have talked about this a lot. We're both old enough to remember when you were promoting Muhammad Ali, and these fights were available, generally speaking, on free television all the time, and they came fast and furious and somewhat regularly, and boxing occupied a place that it does not candidly now, and I believe that this is one of the big reasons why. In your view, what has the pay-per-view phenomenon meant to the sport of boxing?
Well, you know, it's put money in a lot of people's pockets, including mine, which has been good. But on the other hand, it has limited the visibility of the sport. You're quite correct. In 1978, the first Ali Spinks fight was on CBS, and the second Ali Spinks fight from New Orleans was on ABC. And it was, for many years, the most watched program in history. Therefore, boxing had a huge, huge following. Once boxing went to premium television, HBO and Showtime, the audience was limited because the platform of HBO or Showtime is relatively limited as against free-to-air television. And then to compound it, the big fights were all on pay-per-view. Now, there is a role for pay-per-view fights, but you can't keep jamming these fights into the public and having them pay big money month after month, because if you do, the sport is going to die. And thanks to ESPN, we're going to bring back the sport of boxing. Once people can see Manny Pacquiao with Jeff Horn, for example, On that card, we have this great Irish kid, Mick Conlan, who people will be seeing on that telecast. Once they see these fighters in massive numbers, they're going to be hooked again to the sport of boxing.
So just so I can understand what you're saying, and it seems like the free boxing or the free TV boxing to get the massive amounts of eyes to see it, but still the bigger fights, the biggest fights, you don't think you're not going to get rid of pay-per-view. Those are still going to be on pay-per-view, correct?
Yes, of course. I mean, but it's got to be limited, and it's got to be fights that are special and fights that people look at as being very competitive. Those fights will remain on pay-per-view, but not in the quantity that we have today.
Mike, the legendary Bob Arum is with us. Before we get specifically into the one fight that people will talk the most about, whether they should be or they shouldn't be, what is your overall feeling on what it would do for boxing if there was some sort of centralized commission? We've heard different people in the government over the course of years, in Congress, talk about the possibility of that. The other sports have a centralized commission that creates a circumstance where everyone might be able to prosper, as opposed to one where there's a lot of power in a very small number of people, and then only a few people, as you point out, wind up making huge amounts of money. What would your view be on what it would do for the sport if there were some sort of centralized commission?
Well, you realize the league situation, which has a centralized commissioner like football or basketball, is different because they're franchises and they have an incentive to join together for the good of all of them. Boxing is different. There's no real bar to entry. Anybody with a bank account can become a promoter. I don't think it would help necessarily if we had a federal commission. I'm a states' rights guy. I believe that states can, and many do, regulate boxing well. I mean, California, Nevada, New York have good commissions. So I think the answer really is let it flow, but let's get these fights before the biggest possible audiences. And once we do, people will begin to pay more attention to the sport. The sport will grow because, remember, it's a sport that can appeal and does appeal to everyone. It's a global sport. People around the world participate in boxing, whether it's in China or Australia or England. There are people from all countries who have boxers, and the rules are relatively simple and people can follow them. We just need the exposure, and thanks to ESPN and what they're doing in this fight, Manny Pacquiao world title fight against Jeff Horn, I think we're on the way to getting just that done.
And again, that's July 1st, 9 Eastern. So then about 7 weeks after that comes the Mcgregor-Mayweather fight. And so just right off the bat, when you first heard that that was going to happen, that it got done, that it got a date, that it was official, what were your initial thoughts?
Well, I don't like to really criticize the fight that any other promoter puts on. I mean, I have a real difficulty looking at it as a competitive matchup, given the fact that McGregor has never participated in a boxing match. But then again, nobody is putting a gun to anybody's head. You either believe it's non-competitive and therefore pass on it, or you want to see it and you pay your money. So, I mean, the marketplace will dictate whether that fight does well or doesn't do well. I'm inclined to believe that it will do well because people will be curious, but as far as I'm concerned, I don't look at it really as a competitive matchup.
There are some who worry that it is getting so much attention and that people will shell out their money for that it might take attention and money away from other much more legitimate boxing matches that are out there. Is that a concern you have?
No, I don't think so. I mean, people aren't stupid. I mean, I mean, the people who want to watch boxing, you know, there are some great fighters out there. Terence Crawford, this Vasyl Lomachenko, who may be the best fighter since Muhammad Ali. All of these fighters will find audiences, and all they need is exposure. Manny Pacquiao and Jeff Horn, because it's being shown on ESPN and nobody has to go into their pocket, will have a appreciably bigger audience watching it than Mayweather McGregor, where you have to pay maybe 90 or 100 bucks to watch it.
And you're right about the Mayweather McGregor. People are going to either tune in because of the possible show, and some think McGregor has a shot. Both of us here don't think he has a shot at all. So from a competitive standpoint, maybe not so much. But then it's about the promoting of it and the show. Let's go back to 1976 when you from boxing and Vince McMahon from wrestling you promoted this. Muhammad Ali and Antonio Inoki, the professional wrestler, they had a bout together. So take us through that and the seriousness and/or entertainment value and promotional value of that.
I mean, Ali Inoki, which you're right, I promoted, was one of the worst things that I've done in my professional promotional career. Herbert Muhammad, the manager of Ali, asked me to promote that fight. Japanese people. Inoki was a wrestler who performed in Japan, had come up with a lot of money. I had signed Ali to fight Ken Norton later in the year in September in Yankee Stadium. And so I went along with Herbert and agreed to promote that fight. And then I realized, what the hell was I promoting? I mean, how can you promote a boxer against a wrestler? How are you going to do it? So I went to my friend Vince McMahon, and I said, Vince, how am I going to do this? And Vince, of course, being a great wrestling promoter, said, here's what you're going to do. You tell Ali to fool around for a few rounds, and then finally he gets Inoki up against the ropes and looks like he's throwing real vicious punches at Inoki. Now, Inoki, who was a great professional wrestler, used to keep a razor, a little razor, in his mouth so he could actually cut himself and blood could come down. That was one of the great things that he was known for. So Inoki would cut himself, the blood would come down, and Ali, the humanitarian, would turn to the referee, please stop the fight, please stop the fight. The referee wouldn't. Finally, Ali would turn his whole body around to the referee and say, you got to stop the fight. Inoki would jump on his back, and the referee would count 1, 2, 3. Inoki would win the fight, and Ali would claim it was another Pearl Harbor. That was the script. Now, when Ali gets to Japan, he goes and sees my PR guy, and he says, when do we start practicing? And there was a fellow who worked for the Japanese, who was a union guy from the United States, and he was the only person in the world that thought this was legitimate. And he says, what practice? And that spooked Ali. So I had to fly over to Japan and sit, was Angelo, Ferdy Pacheco, myself, day after day with the Japanese trying to get rules for this fiasco. We never could get the rules. They threatened that they would break Ali's leg so he couldn't go into the Norton fight. And anyway, we had no rules going into the fight. The fight was in the morning for closed circuit at prime time in the United States. Vince, meanwhile, was doing undercard fights in Shea Stadium, Andre the Giant against Chuck Wepner, Vern Gagne in Chicago, all over the country, a wrestler and a boxer. But those were staged, so they worked like a charm. Ali Inoki had no script. So now the bell rings, and the first thing Inoki does was go on his behind and kick out his feet. And Ali is running around, and by the third round, he's yelling, "You yellow, get up and fight." And, of course, Inoki didn't know about fighting. He was an actor. But he had on his feet, he had on the shoes, he had spikes. And when he kicked out his legs, he would cut Ali's legs until Angelo Dundee saw what was happening, made him change his shoes. But anyway, Ali's legs were infected from the fight. And at one point in the fight, Inoki did stand up, and Ali threw a punch and missed Inoki by a foot. But Inoki, being the great wrestling actor that he was, staggered back like it was the punch that had landed on Sonny Liston. But we went through 15 rounds of this nonsense, and finally the referee called it a draw. But meanwhile, Ali's leg becomes infected, and we almost lost the fight with Ken Norton. Almost lost in the sense of it not happening that September. So that was my one experience with this kind of nonsense. Now, I'm not saying that McGregor and Mayweather will be like that, but after all, look at McGregor's record as a boxer, 0-0. This is this. You say, well, he's the best MMA guy. So what? He's not the. He's fighting against a world-class boxer. It would be the same if you took a great athlete like LeBron James and you put him in with this Joshua kid. I mean, he'd get destroyed, as great an athlete as James is. I can tell you one more story that's sort of interesting. Years ago, I was promoting Ali in England. He was fighting Brian London. And the great football player, Jim Brown, who was the one who introduced me to Ali, and was in London making the movie Dirty Dozen. And Jim had made up his mind that he was not going to play football anymore. Nobody knew this. But Jim came over to the hotel I was staying, and he said, "Bob, do me a favor, go speak to Ali. I could fight Ali in the ring, and it would make a ton of money." Now, Jim Brown was the greatest athlete that I had seen to that point. Jim Brown got into fights with everybody in football, whether they were linemen or running backs like Cookie Gilchrist, but he would beat the hell out of any football player that he had an argument with. And he had participated in amateur boxing when he was a young man in college. And he was obviously in college a great lacrosse player, great baseball player, and the greatest football player. So he was the top guy. So I thought, hey, this is pretty reasonable. So I went to Ali and I presented it to Ali. And Ali said, "Bob, bring Jim to Hyde Park where I run in the morning, and let me talk to Jim and see if he's really serious." So I brought Jim out to Hyde Park, and Ali says to Brown, "Jim, throw punches at me, hit me as hard as you want, really throw these haymakers to knock me out." And Brown says, "You're crazy." He says, "No, Jim, throw those punches." Brown threw punches for at least a minute, couldn't hit him on the behind. I mean, couldn't land a punch on Ali. And Ali took his two hands, I'll never forget it, and slapped Brown about 60 times in the face. And he says, "Jim, "Do you really want to fight me?" And Brown said, "Nah, better off stick to acting."
Oh, that is
and walked away.
what a
That's
story.
a great story.
That we could do this forever. The fight, again, Manny Pacquiao, Jeff Horn from Australia, July 1st, 9 Eastern on ESPN. Let's do this again. Bob Arum, thank you
Bob.
so much for the time and the stories today.
My pleasure being on. Good luck, guys.
What a joy. Thank you so much. That's unbelievable stuff. Bob Arum with us. Mike and Mike presented by Progressive Insurance. Also brought to you by Dollars.